And whereas 13 years ago, my wife and I were so ill that we could not walk. Just 4 years later, on October 24th, 1999, we went to Washington, D.C., and we ran the Marine Corps Marathon, 26.2 miles. Thank you. You bet. And we finished the same day we started. Now, I use the term run very loosely, okay? The winners that day crossed the finish line in 2 hours and 8 minutes. We crossed the finish line in 8 hours and 2 minutes. There you go. Hey, we didn't finish last. We beat the pregnant lady. There was a woman out there who was 3 months pregnant. I told Kathy, if she tries to pass us, I'm going to knock her down. You can't get beaten by a pregnant lady. And we beat that lady who was celebrating her 82nd birthday. Man, she was fast. Picture this. October 24th, 1999. It was a cool, crisp, clear autumn morning in our nation's capital. As we left the hotel and headed over to the race course, the sun was just coming up over the Iwo Jima Monument. It was a spectacular sunrise. And as we came over this rise and looked down on a valley below, it was full of color and excitement as 18,000 runners gathered at the starting line. 18,000 runners! 18,000 little skinny people. Then there was me, and Kathy had no trouble finding me in the crowd. And there were tens of thousands of people lining the race course. One estimate had 100,000 people out there. It was incredible. The Marine Corps band was decked out in their dress blues playing patriotic songs. There were hot air balloons flying around. There were media helicopters hovering overhead. The excitement was palpable. Linda, tell my wife I got that word right. And it was so hard. 26.2 miles. 8 hours out on the race course. Our bodies just started locking up. Our muscles started to cramp. We became dehydrated and covered in salt. Our feet began to swell and bleed. We'd get blisters and they would break, and new blisters would form underneath them. The constant pounding of 8 hours on the pavement crushed my toenails against the tops of my shoes. I knew I was in trouble when my thighs kept rubbing together and my underpants burst into flames. The guy behind me kept saying, "I smell smoke." It was so hard. We barely made it across the finish line. We barely made it back to the hotel. And when we did get back to the room, we made the mistake of sitting down. And our bodies just locked up in shock. We couldn't move. We just sat there for like 3 hours and stared at each other. She was on one side of the room, I was on the other. We couldn't move. Finally, she said, the least you can do is turn on the TV. I said, you get the remote. I can't move. We didn't know how we were going to get home. It started getting dark. We started getting scared. We finally came up with a plan. We said, if the sun comes up in the morning and we're still sitting here, we'll call down to the lobby, tell them to come on up, get the luggage, and oh, by the way, there'll be a couple of extra large bags to deal with. When we finally did get home, the first thing I had to do was go to the doctor. The first thing I had to do was go to the podiatrist to have my toenails removed. Then I went to the proctologist to have my head removed. What was I thinking? That I could run a marathon? Oh. In closing, I'd like to tell you one more story about that marathon. It's a pretty amazing story. When we crossed the finish line, one of the really cool things was the Marine Corps Commandant put the finisher's medals around our necks. We were pretty proud. But then my wife, Kathy, really put it in perspective for me. You see, all this time I thought we were just running a race. She showed me that we were living our lives in the moment. As we crossed the finish line, she pulled a piece of paper out of her pocket. It was old and yellowed and tattered. And as she unfolded it, I recognized it as her chemotherapy schedule from 4 years before. She'd kept it all that time. And I'll never forget the day the doctor gave it to her, because it was a 6-month calendar with over 50 medical appointments listed on it. And I'll never forget how she just stared at it, and tears welled up in her eyes. And she looked up at me and she said, "How am I going to do this? How am I going to get through this? There are so many." And I felt so helpless. All I could do was hold her and tell her that we were just going to show up one day at a time. And I got to tell you, folks, those were the hardest 6 months of our lives. There were times she didn't think she was going to make it. There were times I didn't think she was going to make it. I've never seen anyone so ill. The worst times were the middle of the night. It'd be pitch black. We'd be sound asleep. And all of a sudden, she would sit straight up in bed, sweat pouring off of her bald head, and she'd just scream, "Please make the pain stop." And I felt so helpless. All I could do was hold her. But then a miracle occurred. The sun came up in the morning. She made it through the night. And then the next day, the sun came up again. And she survived. Somehow, by the grace of Almighty God, somehow she survived. And there we were, 4 years later, standing on the finish line of our marathon. And she took that chemotherapy schedule and she tore it into little pieces. And she threw it in the air. And she said, "We are alive. We are survivors. And now I know what it means to be a survivor." You see, the race belongs not only to the strong and the swift, but to those who just keep running. As I leave you here today, I hope you will allow our story to be a gentle reminder to laugh every day, to work hard at maintaining your sense of humor, to find your own marathon, whatever that might be, and finish it. We're all survivors. We've all been beaten and battered by the cruel winds of fortune and fate, but we're alive. And I'll leave you with the words of Patrick Overton. When you come to the edge of all the light you know and are about to step off into the darkness of the unknown, faith is knowing that one of two things will happen. There will be something solid for you to stand on. You will be taught how to fly. Every now and then, folks, we get lucky, and both things happen. The American Cancer Society and their wonderful staff and volunteers, God bless your hearts, have given us something incredibly solid to stand on. Now take that and fly. God bless you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Roger, do you want this?
You see the way she did that?
Thank you, Roger.